Hi, this is Breach Burke, and this is our Monday Chthonia live stream. This is one of those weeks where I'm live streaming on the same week that I released a podcast, because I usually release them on Mondays for the general public. They get released on Sundays, at least the audio version gets released on Sundays for those who subscribe to my Patreon. So the podcast for this week is on St. Catherine of Siena. So if you haven't checked that one out, that's a really interesting podcast on the subject of embodiment. In particular, the way in which you talk about a saintly being like Catherine of Siena, the way in which the body becomes used and also becomes a metaphor for her own mystical experience, while at the same time there's a whole lot there about denying the body. So it's this almost tension between this Virgin Mary model that you have of femininity and the way femininity is supposed to be, right? Or at least what the ideal is within that type of culture. And even if people who don't subscribe to Christianity, or even any of the monotheisms, there's still some elements of that creep in. So anyway, it is an interesting podcast. And she is a very interesting figure. I'm probably sure there's a lot more I probably could have said about her, but I just tried to stick to some of the basic elements. So anyway, if you watch the podcast, which I'm sure if you're on this channel you probably do at least at some point, I hope you enjoy that episode. The other things that are new here, I'm still trying to get some practical things sorted, just my quick update. I did finally get health insurance for myself again, because I had insurance that was just ridiculously expensive. It was like $600-$700 a month, and I'm like, I'm not making that kind of income right now. I mean, yeah, I can pay that money, but I maybe couldn't pay my mortgage, So so it's been a bit of jockeying, and finally, what I've been trying to do is get onto the exchange. And this time I was able to, and I was able to get reasonably priced insurance, which is not, in the grand scheme of things, that terrible. I mean, the benefits of it seem to be pretty good. And I have dental as well now, so that's good. I've been wanting to go back to the dentist, and I haven't, it's just nice to have a plan just to pay for that. So anyway, that's neither here nor there. What I wanted to talk about today, on our little live stream topic, this was one that came, I had several different things I want to talk about, because I was initially thinking about the idea of embodiment because I did Catherine of Siena, but I think that's a topic I want to do another time. This morning when I was having my coffee, and those of you who know me know that's my time, I get up quite early, depending on when the sun comes up. Right now it's winter, so I get up a little bit later. This morning it was around 5:36 in the morning, I think I woke up, and I always make my coffee, and and then that's when I have my mind starts to become active. I mean, I like to watch the sun come up. I like the point in the day when things are really, really quiet, and then I don't hear, I mean, there's still, even at that hour of the morning, there's still people out on the highway that's over there. And highway is kind of an overstatement. It's a 2-lane highway, but it is technically a highway. And people are out getting ready to go to work already. I used to be one of those people. And that is the time of the morning where it's that I'm evaluating dream material I've had from the night before, and when I'm kind of sitting down and trying to get a sense of where I'm at, because as somebody who used to have an extraordinarily planned life, now my life seems to be quite radically unplanned in a lot of ways. So I'm answering questions this morning about monthly income. I'm like, no idea. I could make this much money this month. I could make nothing next month. I have no idea. So I'm always constantly reevaluating where I'm at. And the topic that came into my mind today, I think it's because I've been seeing some things recently. Well, I talked about Sylvia Plath last week, okay? And then I was also watching these different things when I go through my YouTube stream and so forth. There's a certain amount of political material there, obviously, with a lot of the political drama that's going on in the U.S. right now. Unfortunately, we are in another presidential election year, which means that the drama increases exponentially. And regardless of your viewpoint on politics, because I'm not turning this into a live stream on politics, But the Trump trials are a big thing that are just about everywhere. It's really hard to avoid and to stay away from discussion of that. And one of the things that seems to be very broadly discussed was the E. Jean Carroll case, where Trump was basically by New York law, legal definition, he's guilty of rape. And he is now in this trial to try to determine what the consequences are going to be of that. What kind of fines is he going to have to pay? What kind of damages to E. Jean Carroll for the ruin of her reputation and things like that. And so, there's the whole, I don't want to get into that, there's a whole rigmarole around that. But the thing that was being focused on was his lawyer, who is a woman called Alina Habba. And she's, I guess, scraping the bottom of the barrel because she is literally, her whole display at that trial, and again, I don't care whether you like Trump or not, it was appalling. She literally had no idea what she was doing. And it was interesting because one of the things that had come on, I don't remember which channel it was, but they showed her on a podcast. And in this podcast, somebody asked her the question, or she brought up somebody asking her the question, would you rather be pretty or would you rather be smart? Okay, which that's an interesting question in and of itself, because that is part of the cultural narrative says you cannot be both. Okay, you can't be intelligent and you can't be smart. You have to be one or the other. If you're female, by the way, if you're female, you can't be both. And she said, well, of course I'd rather be pretty because I can fake being smart. And generally the consensus was, no, actually you can't, and you don't. You don't. You can't fake being smart because you're not. But it kind of made me think about people like her, people like Marjorie Taylor Greene, people, and even getting away from the females, even people like Trump himself. It started to make me think about the kind of narrative that's being put forth there, or the kind of legal strategy or non-legal strategy that's being put forth there. And it's basically sort of, again, regardless, it is kind of a middle school kind of strategy. It's just like, whatever you say, I'm going to just say, oh, no, you're wrong, you're lying. It's just gainsaying, it's like the old argument sketch in Monty Python, right? Yes, it is. No, it isn't. Yes, it is. No, it isn't. And nobody really gets anywhere because the idea is just to, see how much you can slag off your opponent. And this seems to be the way, like, politics is being done today. This seems to be the way a lot of things are being done. And it's not... And so it makes me question, like, what is it about this middle school mentality that seems to have taken over culture right now, at least in that sense? And like I said, when I think about people like MTG, and I think about Alina Habba as she is in the courtroom, Lauren Boebert, like, people like this, it's almost like they're trying to do the mean girl thing. They're trying to do the middle school mean girl thing. Like, we're the popular mean girls and, we're just going to bully anybody who we think is different or doesn't fit in with the narrative that we're trying to, go along with here. And this made me think a lot about what, sort of how do we get to a place like this in this culture? And because honestly, and again, I don't care what your political opinion is, this is just not helpful to anybody in any way, shape, or form. This does not solve the problems of society. This doesn't advance us in any way. This is literally like we are watching Real Housewives or some kind of crappy reality show in real time, and that this is what we're living. And of course, it's not reality. But it does make me think. It does make me go back to something that I did connect with Sylvia Plath, and a friend of mine this morning, my lovely friend Ellen, checked in. She'll probably be watching this, so hello, Ellen. We message each other on WhatsApp quite regularly, and one of the things she had said to me about another discussion we were having about Plath was she said, Plath had this kind of perfectionism. She was kind of an all or none. It's like either I can do everything right or I can't. And she was referring specifically to what they call the Mademoiselle episode, when she was, I guess, it was in the 1950s. Was it 1950? That she was, she was at Smith College and she was selected with some other girls for a guest editorship at Mademoiselle. And Mademoiselle, of course, as we know, is a fashion magazine. I remember reading it years and years ago. I don't think I've looked at it in 25 years. But in any case, Mademoiselle is one of those, like Elle and Vogue, and, it's one of those kind of magazines. And basically out of that thing, this is where she had her first mental breakdown, and she went home because she didn't feel, there was kind of like, she wasn't like these other girls who were picked. This wasn't this New York City atmosphere. This was not her world. Okay, this was not her world. This was not where she shone or where she felt that she could keep up. And there's this idea of her as being like either everything had to be perfect or it was a complete failure. And this definitely reminds me of Trump's kind of thinking. And I'm not comparing Plath to him, but it is a mode of thinking that people have. And in Trump's case, I think he inherited this from his father, this idea that if you lose at something or you fail, then you just are, like, there's literally, losing is not an option, okay? In Sylvia Plath's case, I feel like this was something that came out of her relationship to her mother, because her mother pushed her. You have to be the best at everything. And this, of course, led to her marriage to Ted Hughes, who was a kind of a intellectual celebrity in his own right. And this was the idea that this was like her, this prime catch of a husband that she'd gotten. But the way in which, the problem is in the marriage situation, there's a lot more that can go wrong there because because whatever your image of that person is, actual real life does seep in. And the dynamics between two people and all of the baggage they may be carrying with them personally, culturally, again, depending on their families, how they were raised, what their expectations are, their own relationship to the archetypes is going to dictate how that marriage comes out. And we're talking about a heterosexual marriage, okay? I realize there are other types of marriage as well. But if we just look at these particular cases, you're looking at a situation in which to say that you're going to have the perfect marriage, for instance, I don't know what that means, because I think even the most happily married couples, have times where things are very much far from perfect. So you can't, so it's this perfectionism idea. And then it makes me think to a lot of my students, how many students have I had who get an A-, say, in my class, and then they're like, but professor, I need an A. I can't have an A-. I have to have an A. Like, my life is going to implode if I don't have an A. And I'm like, but you didn't earn an A. I mean, you're a good student and you did a good job, but, you got half the final wrong, or you got something, you did something that put you in that slightly, but you see this, and a lot of times there's this sense of everything just has to be perfect, but there doesn't necessarily have to have the work or anything that goes into that. That's another piece of it. And there's also not the understanding that you have to put effort into things and that you have to fail at certain things in order to be able to succeed at them. It's just as you don't separate dark from light, you don't separate success from failure. I mean, the two of those things come together in their own way. Okay. But this does gets me back to what the core thing is that I had wanted to mention today. And it's basically this idea of core mythologies, okay? And when I say mythology, I'm using this in a broader context. I'm not just talking about Greek and Roman myth or the kinds of things that we usually associate with mythology, or the gods or deities or beliefs of a particular culture. Mythology is about more than that. Mythology, I think, on that kind of meta level, it's like our meta-narratives. It's the stories that we have about how things are. And I've said previously that the meta-narratives that we have generally in some broad sense are around security, and they're also around relationship. So a lot of times our fear narratives or our crisis narratives can be around either not having enough materially, like losing financially, a financial crisis, or a housing crisis, or something like that. Or it is a relationship one, so it's a breaking up with somebody, it's the death of a family member, or it's being picked up and put in a new situation and having to build a familiar network all over again, and the stress that goes along with that, okay? So there's this, and so the question is, when we are in those critical moments, a lot of us don't necessarily think about the mythologies. If things are basically just kind of going along and, they're not, maybe they're neither good nor bad, maybe they're great, but then it's also a matter of determining what makes something great. There's certain stories about how we feel things are supposed to be in order for us to feel that either pleasurable or to feel comfortable. Crises are actually there. They have a certain transformational power, but when you live in that kind of perfectionist way of thinking, then that pain is that's not allowed. It's like, no, I have to do everything right. I have to do everything right the first time. And every decision I make has to be a fruitful one, and everything I do has to be right. And this is a narrative that gets back to something I read recently, and I want to read a little bit of it to you. And again, it's from this book that Ellen lent me, The Black Goddess and the Sixth Sense. And he's talking about the myth of Oedipus, okay? And this is just even in his introduction. He's talking about Freud and how Freud developed the idea of the Oedipus complex, which, if you're not familiar with what that is, I think most people are, but it's the idea, it's the whole narrative of kill your father, marry your mother, okay, which is what Oedipus does, unwittingly. He does it, there's oracles, his parents hear the oracle, so they put him out, and, they pin his feet, and they put him out, they have him exposed as an infant, to die, which is something that they did, with children that they wanted to get rid of. There are some cultures that still do it. But that's why he was called Oedipus, swollen foot, because he had the pin between his feet. But a shepherd felt sorry for this baby and instead brought him to a neighboring city where he grew up and assumed that those were his parents. And then somebody at some drunken revel said, it's not really your parents. And so, and they told him, oh, no, don't listen to that person. They're just drunk. Well, in vino veritas, right? So he goes to the oracle and he gets the same oracle that his parents had gotten. You're going to kill your father, marry your mother. He's horrified by this, as anybody would be. And so he gets up and he leaves Corinth and he ends up heading back to Thebes. And this is where he actually fulfills the prophecy that's been said to him. Now, typically, we look at Oedipus, look at it as a question of free will versus determinism, right? So how much do you have control over? Did he have control over his fate? The fact that an oracle told him what was going to happen for him didn't change the fact that it was going to happen, because you would think, right, well, that's the parents did this, and he did this, right? We're going to prepare for this. We're going to make sure that this prophecy doesn't come true. We're going to take steps, rational steps to subvert this. But they're doing this without all the relevant information. So when you do take steps like that, and then, of course, the steps that he took just walked him right back into the narrative he was trying to avoid. Okay. So this is what Peter Redgrove says about this. He says, the image of Oedipus and his cursed nature and the plagues visited on his world by his apparently innocent actions, because he murdered the king Laios, not being aware that he did, and he solves the riddle of the Sphinx. Now, he has a different opinion on that, but you solve the riddle of the Sphinx goes away, he's a hero to Thebes, because the Sphinx was the plague of the city, right? And then he's given the queen as his wife, and he becomes king, and then all of a sudden there are plagues, and the plagues are because there's a murderer in the city walls. He doesn't realize that it's him, okay? So through his actions, let's just stop here for a minute. Through his actions, he is somebody who's trying to do the right thing. If somebody told you were going to kill your father and marry your mother, if you were, if that was going to happen, then you would probably probably do the same thing. Like, well, now since I have this information, what am I going to do with it? I'm going to do something. I'm going to take constructive steps to avoid this. I'm going to avoid this. In other words, we think we can control what's fated. Okay. And as a result, you end up doing the thing where if you had just left things alone, maybe it never would have happened, weirdly enough. Maybe it wouldn't have. We don't know. But this is interesting. He says, his apparently innocent actions correspond to the way modern Western humanity sees itself. Clever, proud, full of good intentions, and yet inescapably doomed. Okay, this is the way we see each other. This is the meta-narrative he's talking about. What goes on in the minds of these people? They are smart at doing stupid things, was the comment of a Marshallese woman and the Dennis O'Rourke film Half-Life. And they were talking about how the Marshall Islands took the brunt of, the bikini fallout with the atomic bomb. Okay, these are smart people doing stupid things, and that's a very specific example, but we see this a lot. We see very smart people, and we're thinking, okay, goes back to what I said. And I've said this since Chthonia came into being. I said this while I was doing my doctoral. Human beings are not rational. You are not a rational creature. You are not a product of your mind. I mean, we've kind of become that way because that's the only way we know how to negotiate the outside world is through the mind. But the fact that that is the case doesn't mean that's the right way to go about things. Okay. So, so he's talking about Freud's Oedipal complex and also the fact that Freud seemed to be in a cocaine-induced haze when he came up with the idea. But anyway, that aside. He says, drug-induced or not, Freud's paradigm seems undoubtedly there. Okay? One can ask, however, not only if it's true, but if it's the whole of the truth. One can treat the legend and the play of Sophocles, Oedipus Rex. He actually has 3 plays about Oedipus. Oedipus Rex, Oedipus at Colonus, and then Antigone are the 3. As though it were a dream, redreamed in a drug-dueling self-analysis by the 20th century genius. He's referring to Freud here. And he does point out that just because someone is a genius doesn't mean that they're right. But anyway. Dreams, including collective ones, are meant to be questioned. They are like the riddles of the Sphinx. He says, we can interrogate this ancient legend, so powerful that Lowell Edmonds says the literatures of England and most of the countries of Western Europe have their Oedipuses. And often a country's Oedipus forms a whole chapter in the history of its literature. Okay? And, so this was, although he has been such an exemplary and influential hero, nobody can decide whether Oedipus was clever or stupid in his cleverness. Lowell Edmonds has usefully compiled 20th century opinions. Simply because he solved the alleged riddle, Oedipus was a hero of the intellect to both Hegel and Nietzsche. The classicists Bernard Knox and E.R. Dodd saw the same quality. To the latter, personally, Oedipus is a kind of symbol of human intelligence, which cannot rest until it has solved all the riddles. Oedipus thus becomes a symbol of questing, visualizing modern scientific intelligence. Why then should he blind himself in the end? Again, this is a very long introduction on this, but really what he concludes here is that, here he says it. The meaning of the blinding of Oedipus is that to achieve our transformation, we need something more than our eyes. Okay? And truthfully, in Greek mythology, that is a thing. When you see these people, these characters that become blind, and I'm sure this is not the first time I've mentioned this, but when characters become blind, they are suddenly able to have this broader vision, ironically, of other things. They can't see what's in the external world, or they might only know it through feel or through other senses, but they become prophetic. They're able to see something, the bigger picture, because they're not using their eyes. Okay? And this gets back to the whole idea that we are very, very driven by our minds. This drive to perfection is something that comes from the mind, because the mind is always analyzing and turning something over and criticizing it. Okay? I'm sure a lot of you lay awake at night thinking about stuff, worrying about stuff, or the outcomes of stuff, or preparing yourself mentally for the outcomes of things that you are anxious about, and probably 95% of those things don't actually ever happen. Okay? We have a certain situation or encounter, or we get a piece of information that leaves us uncertain about something, so then we start imagining all the things that are going to come out of it, and we worry about it. We give ourselves insomnia, we go crazy. And we, because we, even though we have senses that help us go with the flow of those things, we have an intuition, we have an instinct, we have other senses that we can tap into. If you connect to nature enough, you can actually even get information in that way as well, which I don't want to dive into that as a kind of diversion here. But there, it's not. we privilege the mind in a way that we shouldn't. Now, that doesn't mean that, every impulse or everything that comes through us is necessarily correct, but we just tend to have this idea that if something can't be, that we think that, we think that we know better than nature. In the riddle of the Sphinx is actually a representation of nature. She's a kind of zoomorphic figure. She's got this female head, and she's got this body of a lion and of a bird. She represents kind of all of these different elements. The ferocity of the lion. There's the birds. There's this idea of creatures of the air, but also that's very much connected to the underworld. Certainly in the ancient underworld, there was the idea of the soul that was winged. Ancient Babylon certainly has this idea that souls of the dead were winged, and birds might have been equated with that in some idea. So the Sphinx becomes this kind of Chtonic representation of life and death. And when Oedipus looks at her and she gives her riddle, which now he mentions Robert Graves, and I don't have full trust of Robert Graves and what Robert Graves said. But basically, the fundamental question that the Sphinx is really asking, and the original riddle is said to be, which is never mentioned in the play, by the way. It's not mentioned in the Oedipus play. But the riddle was supposedly what walks on 4 legs, then on 2, and then on 3. And, of course, Oedipus's answer to that is man, because man crawls on all 4s, then walks on 2 legs, and then walks with a cane. And, of course, as he points out, well, surely women do that as well. But, you could have the whole argument about man as being a general term that it was. But it's also the idea that, they said really the question she's asking is what dies. There's kind of the sense of what dies. And so according to Graves' version, as soon as he says man dies, she says, well, then I die. And so what happens, he says, at that point, the feminine impulse there removes itself from the world and stops instructing. Because, you're confronting the Sphinx, you're confronting this riddle, and you are approaching it from this modicum of control, from this modicum of the mind, of the clever mind that solves puzzles. And and the riddle of the Sphinx, she goes away. And some people say she may have gone away because of the wrongness of his answer. It's just like if that's what you think is, if that's your understanding of life and death is only in terms of yourself, only in terms of humanity, which is the way we look at all of nature. We're the apex of nature, right? That's another mythology. We're because we have rationality, we are better than everything else, and we don't want to be like that other part of things. And I've talked about that. But this particular mythology, it's very important to understand. Again, I've always been a proponent that it's important to know what the mythology is of the culture that you're living in, like what you are doing here. And it also reminds me of something, and I usually give this to my religion students kind of at the end, is to go back to Alan Watts and his discussion of the 2 models of the universe that we have tended to have as culture, at least in what, as Redgrove is characterizing as Western Europe and so forth. And that is what he calls the ceramic versus the fully automatic model. Now, the ceramic model says everything is made. Okay, that's the idea that God makes things. Humans are made out of clay, right? Jesus is a carpenter. Not by accident. There's this idea of master craftsman, the one who makes stuff. Even you see it in Egyptian mythology with a god like Ptah, who's a master maker who makes things. But the way that has certainly come down in our culture is the idea of this God who's made all this stuff, made you, and now kind of sits there as this benevolent ruler. It kind of ends up in this paradigm where you have this benevolent king who is judging you and judging your actions. And that this idea really falls into the way we do science, because we think about scientific law and hierarchy and things like that. Like, that's certainly part of that as well. And also you see it in certain religious organizations as well. It's been pointed out that Protestant ministers, at least traditionally, looked a lot like judges. If you were thinking, like, if you look at the Puritans, for example, and you look at the way everybody files into this room that has removed all the trappings of, like, a Catholic, of a cathedral or something, right? Because, all that's blasphemous and fetishists and whatever it is. And instead now we just have a guy who looks like a judge who's talking at us for 3 hours in a place that looks remarkably like a courtroom. It's just got a big, usually a very plain cross or something there. But it's not about the mystery. It's about the judgy part of it. It's about the legalese part of it, the part that the rationality can deal with. And so what Watts pointed out was that, with the Enlightenment and with other philosophical ways of thinking, we get the 18th, 19th century, 20th century. Eventually we get to this more atheistic idea that says, which he said is exactly the same model, because it's still built on the idea of laws and this structure and order. It's just that the lawgiver or the creator or whatever is just taken out of it. So you just take it out and say, no, that's not necessary. You don't need this figure here, so let's get rid of it. And his point is that both of these do kind of fit into this Oedipal model in some way, because either way, these are still ways that kind of privilege the idea of judgment, which is a mental process largely, right? It privileges this idea of intellect as what is higher, as being represented as that which is intellectual. Okay, and so this is the thing, and Watts's view was that both of those models are wrong, and they're both the same model. It's just one has this being and one doesn't, and we're not really aware of that when we see these arguments. Where you have kind of atheism versus religion. Okay, you see a lot of this it shows up a lot in comedy. It shows up a lot in different places. It's not atheism versus religion. You got atheists. Okay, and what we think of as the Western religious paradigm are the same thing. They're the same thing. They're coming from the same place. It's just that one believes in a God and one doesn't. And that kind of gets me back to what I was saying about this middle school attitude that people have. So developmentally, what does it mean to be middle school, right? Developmentally, middle school is about, it's a stage of development in which we break away from the collective, which we establish ourselves as individuals. Okay? If you talk object relations theory, you are, the infant starts seeing itself as an extension of the mother, potentially. At some point, the infant looks at a mirror image and realizes that that's me. Okay, that's an image of me. That's a projection of me. And then starts to develop up to about the age of 6 or 7. It starts to develop like really what's the core of their own identity. And then as they become teenagers, then that's when you go into kind of rebellion. That's when people withdraw to their room and put their earphones in. Right. That's the period of time when you go off and do things with your friends. You do things that your parents don't know about, right? It's when you are potentially in a rebellious phase. That's when your parents are stupid, right? Or when you go places with your family and you guys go over there and I'm going to stand over here. It's a phase of where, you're too cool for those people. And so there's a phase that you go through. And in theory, what happens when you go through that phase is there's a point at which you establish your own set of circumstances, perhaps, again, if you want to take the family paradigm, you might get married and start your own family. Or, some people, they don't start families, they adopt a bunch of cats or, they'll do something. You've got something that ends up being classified as your adult family. Or you as an adult. And generally as people get older, whatever, and again, this is not always true, but sometimes then the rifts between, family and you, they become, because now you're all out operating from a grown-up space. You're not in that space of trying to separate yourself. So there's kind of a reconciliation there with that. Now it's okay to be around your family again. And if you become a parent yourself, then you go through that whole process with your own children. So now there is a part of this process. So it's almost like you're looking at a group of people who are kind of stuck in this mode in our political world are kind of stuck in that, trying to find acceptance within the mob of their social peers, which is another aspect of this too. Trying to find acceptance in a world now where hormones are at play, and when sexuality is at play, and all of these things that are not when you're a child, not in the same way, because you haven't started to develop into an adult being. And there's all of the things that go along with this, and all of the jockeying and the competing and the positioning and the acceptance and rejection and it can go on at younger ages too, but it especially is a characteristic of that time frame. And so it's almost like we have a culture now that's developmentally stuck in that phase. If we return to the religion question, this usually the development of kind of this beliefs about religion. Okay, if you are raised in a family that is religious or has raised you with religious beliefs, okay, there is the what they call the natural literalistic process, which is where you grow up believing literally what you're told. So if you are, let's just say you're from a Christian family and you go to Bible school or whatever the equivalent is, CCD, whatever it is, you're taught something and you may literally believe that. God made the world and this happened this way and this happened this way. I think the example that used to be given by Dr. Steve Johnson, who used to be the guy who taught me psych and religion, he had just said, it's like Santa Claus. When you're a little kid, you literally believe in Santa Claus, right? Santa Claus literally comes to your house. You put out, cookies and milk, and you do this and you do that, because you literally believe. It's the way people will literally believe in, in fairy tales and things like that. There may be a literal aspect of that belief for a child. And then there's a point at which the first crises hit, okay? And the crises could also just be the kind of hormonal crises that occurs when we hit puberty. But something happens and suddenly you realize that all of that is not literally true. And then you go through what he calls a point of demythologization. So that can be a point. It doesn't have to be, okay? But for some people, it's a point where they say, oh, well, you lied to me about that. It's all a lie. It's all stupid. And I don't believe any of it anymore. Okay? That is a potential reaction. It's not the necessary reaction, but it's a potential one. In any case, it certainly becomes a period of questioning for people. And because it goes along with the whole rebellion factor. Whatever the tradition is also the thing that's going to be called into question. And then at some point, again, like with everything else developmentally, the more life experience you have and the more you go through, the more you see where that piece fits in or doesn't in your life. Some people may never go back to that piece. Some people may reconcile with it when they get older to some degree, maybe not in the same degree. That's why you have so many people, I think, who are like spiritual and not religious, right? They think there's something to it, maybe not the way they were taught, but maybe there's some other piece of it that now fits into the narrative or now makes sense. And I found myself thinking about somebody like Richard Dawkins. I remember trying to read The Selfish Gene, just from the point of view of trying to understand memetics and memes and things like that. And I really couldn't get past the first couple chapters because he is so obnoxiously annoying. He writes with that kind of bullying attitude of kind of like, like that arrogance of how stupid the rest of you are. And how stupid all these things that people believe about the world are. And again, it's the way in which it's couched. I mean, I think some people find it amusing, but I like humor that can be, that may be crude language-wise and so forth, that can be a little bit blunt. I can be a fan of that kind of humor, but this just wasn't funny. I'm just like, you just sound like an arrogant SOB is what you sound like. It was really hard for me to read this book because I was just like, and it's just making these kind of assertions, and I'm thinking, aren't you supposed to be a scientist? Like, aren't you supposed to be providing evidence for these assertions, not other like anybody stupid who doesn't think this? I mean, that was kind of the tone of it, okay? And I found whenever people bring him up, I remember there was was he on Twitter? He was somewhere where he was talking about the idea that children should not be taught fairy tales because it will teach them to be irrational. And I'm like, there's somebody who completely doesn't understand the whole meaning of imagination and fairy tales, and even of myth and religion. Like, this is a guy who literally just doesn't get it because he's actually stuck at the demythologization stage himself. For whatever reason, if this was something he was raised with, he has disavowed it, and it's kind of like he is now on a crusade to stay in that place. It's all stupid and it's all wrong and it all needs to be gotten rid of. And he's not the only one who's in that space. And the thing is, there's people who are like, maybe who have followed a certain tradition their whole life, and then they listen to him and they say, and he just tells them, look, there's no God, you're wrong. And sometimes these people literally have almost breakdowns, like, because this man is telling me this. He doesn't really have any business saying that because he doesn't know what he's talking about. He doesn't know what God is. He doesn't know what religion is. He is simply operating from this very adolescent kind of way of talking about things. You're not talking like a grown man who's a scholar. You're talking like an adolescent who thinks it's all stupid. And and I mean, I'm sure all of us have things in our life that we do think are stupid. It's fair enough, but to make that declaration, to say no, this is the facts. Anything that's outside of my viewpoint is stupid and it's wrong. So okay, so where does this take us back to? I find myself thinking about Robert Anton Wilson. Okay, and he's not the only one to have this idea. If you've never listened to Robert Anton Wilson, there are certain lectures and things of his on YouTube he to me is just brilliant. He was just really a brilliant guy. But one of the concepts that he always talked about was the reality tunnel. And the reality tunnel is basically the meta-narrative that you live in. This is your definition of reality, of normalcy. We were talking about normalcy and standardization last week. What you think, the way you think things are supposed to be, the opinions that you hold in all things, economically, politically, socially, culturally, ethically, whatever it is. This is the tunnel that you're in, and it's a tunnel because we don't admit ideas and thoughts from other places. Now, again, it's not that, especially now where things are so very polarized, it's not always that we think that the ideas from the other side are necessarily good ones or ones that should be seriously entertained, because they're coming from this place that is kind of stripped away from any kind of discourse. Like a lot of our political figures, and again, Trump being a good example, he is a projection point. And because he has almost managed to identify himself archetypally, he's trying to take on this messianic kind of a figure. Like he is trying to act the savior figure, but he's also an embodiment of what we think of as the shadow. Because what is the things that people do like him? What do they like about him? He says the things that people can't say. He dares to interject that chaos in and say, yeah, well, I'm not going to follow the rules. F you. I'm not going to do that. And it's all the things that people feel that for social reasons that they can't do or they can't say, or and now look at him, he's doing all this stuff. Isn't that great? He's a projection point for what's in shadow. What's in shadow is what you repress either out of shame or out of convention. Sometimes things that are in shadow because it's just because they're purely selfish, and it's just kind of like, no, you do have to take into account those around you, the relationships around you. So sometimes there may be purely ego-driven things that we want, but you can't do it. If you like something that your neighbor has, you can't just go break into their house and steal it. There's certain things there's just certain limitations that you have. And the idea is almost, and so at least if you want to look at a positive function of the shadow, some of that is to just kind of keep some of that in check. But although the idea is that if you are working with all your faculties, then in theory, you are not, you may not even be tempted by something like that. But I don't want to get into ethics here because it's not so much about that. It's more about the idea that this is a projection point. This is an individual who's a projection point for for the things that people want to do but can't. And that's why he's so popular with these people. But he's how aware is he and how unaware is he? I mean, there's arguments about how, whether Trump is stupid or whether he's like a 5-year-old or whether there's a method to the madness that seems to go on. And I don't know. He's certainly operating from a space. I feel like he operates more from a space where he is the center of the universe. And whatever is happening has to be with respect to the tunnel that he's in. And all of it has to be him as a winner and that glorifying him. We know that's his narrative because he's told us. And anybody who challenges that narrative or criticizes him is automatically, it's like he's creating this good-evil thing. And saying, oh, look at these bad people. I'm the person who's going to... And so he becomes, in a weird way, he becomes this kind of savior figure for people who... may have ideas or thoughts or opinions that for whatever reason, maybe some of them may be wildly outside of what we think of as part of human, part of social discourse that shows any kind of value of compassion or caring for other people and stuff like that. I mean, the reality is, we all have selfish thoughts. We all have things that we think about. I want to get mine and everybody else. I mean, there's an element of that in all of us. But now it's almost like that's being held up as the way to go or the way to be. So I don't know. So I found myself thinking about him as being this projection point. And the fact, because he is so mired in that egoic thing that's going on, and he's so concerned about his own narrative about winning, because that's driving him consciously or unconsciously. He's just being driven, and also the idea that he should not be accountable or responsible for anything. That's another thing too. We'd all love to do stuff with no accountability, right? We don't want to see consequences of actions. So there's this thing that goes on there, and so what he does is he just continually talks and panders to whatever the people who are, fueling his view of reality, whatever they want to hear. He really doesn't have any statements or opinions or stands on anything other than, I have to win all the time. And so that's really, and people are trying to analyze and talk about this like we're in a normal debate situation. I'm like, no, you're in an archetypal situation here. You are dealing with an archetype. You are dealing with somebody who is trying to deal more in mythology than in rationality. And this is why you need to be aware of the mythology. You need to see what's going on. So this brings me back to where I am with... okay, I want to go back to something that I had read, Matthew Arnold, back when I was in school. And I know I've told the story of Dr. Dell before, because he was a professor who taught Victorian poetry when I was at Montclair State University. I think he's long since retired. I had class with him in 1993. So it's been a long time, obviously. And when you go into a class called Victorian poetry, now I happen to be, as you know, a poetry aficionado, but the Victorians, I mean, there's, if you like the moderns, if you like the confessional style of poetry, some people are really into the romantics, you're kind of your Byron and Shelley, but this would be post-romantics. This is more the realm of people like Matthew Arnold or Thomas Hardy or Robert Browning, Alfred Lord Tennyson. Like this is more that era of poetry. And so you go in thinking this is something you're taking as the English major, and you're thinking, okay, this is going to be a fairly dry class. Dell would get up at the beginning of the class, and the first thing he did was turn around. He's like, okay. He's like, there's a spectrum. He would draw a line across the board, and he'd write real on one side and ideal on the other. And he would say, okay. And so he was talking about different poets, because poets are expressing, they're expressing a mode of something. They're not expressing something prosaically. They're not analyzing it. Poetry is the language of image, okay? So they are poetically expressing something. But he talked about the different poets and where they fell on that line, and he was giving examples of the extremes. He says the Romantics fell off the cliff of the extremes of idealism. He says, but he felt like a lot of Victorians were negotiating that line which Matthew Arnold talks about in an essay called Hellenism versus Hebraism, which gets back to just what we were just saying about a secular view versus one that is driven by what he's calling Hebraism, like, in other words, a monotheistic viewpoint that Judaism, Christianity, Islam, that particular worldview that we associate, with the Abrahamic religions, let's call it. And the different worldviews that come out of that and the way in which they collide with each other. And one of the mythologies that Dell would talk about was, he had talked about, because he said he feels that Thomas Hardy talks about this and some of these others, is the idea, and Tennyson particularly, the idea that you are, that the child is born, again, like the hero myth, in a kind of a pastoral setting, and then at some point they grow up, and again, he's talking about a male child here in particular, but he's saying, like, grows up, and then at some point there's the battle with the father on the darkling plain. That's the way he had couched it. And so you start with this, like, so the metaphor for, like, this beginning of life is like the stream, the little pastoral stream. And so you have this battle of the father, okay, which is also very Oedipal. If you read Oedipus at Colonus, this is him, his son coming to him for a blessing, and him saying, I curse you. You put me in this position, and I curse you. Like, because this was when brother was fighting against brother for control of Thebes. And so there's this thing, and then of course it ends in the ocean, right? It ends in the idea that everything is eventually this great vast ocean, of which maybe you're just a pebble that's kind of ground up. It's this rather dark kind of image, but he said that's really the modern mythology. Okay, Arnold talks about it, and you see it expressed in the poetry of the Victorians. And the one thing I remember him saying about Arnold, and I don't know, I was looking at it. I looked at my copy of same book that I had, by the way, Hellenism versus Hebraism, and the very last line that Matthew Arnold says is, in referring to the dichotomy between the secular and maybe what we think of as religious thinking, he says, everywhere we see the beginnings of confusion, and we want a clue to some sound order and authority. This we can only get by going back upon the actual instincts and forces which rule our life, seeing them as they really are, connecting them with other instincts and forces, and enlarging our whole worldview and rule of life. Okay? This is Matthew Arnold, right? And the point, and the way that Dell said it, I thought was brilliant. I thought it was the best way. He said, you need to be aware of the mythologies that are around you, and if you don't create a mythology of your own, because remember, we don't live in a time frame where, say, everybody's Catholic or everybody's, and I'm not suggesting we need to go back to that either, but we are definitely in a space, even Joseph Campbell talked about it in the 80s, where there is no core mythology anymore. There is no core cultural narratives. And you have to be very wary of the core cultural narratives that are out there right now. These narratives of perfectionism, these narratives that pull in this good versus evil paradigm, this messianic paradigm that says somebody's going to come in and rescue you. That was something else that I was talking about with Ellen this morning, because she was talking about how that all or nothing thing, and the fact that Sylvia Plath, like her marriage to Ted Hughes, was like supposed to be this great thing, and but at the same time, but then when she died, Ted Hughes is the one who ended up making a decision about what her narrative was and what her legacy was, because that's a narrative of being rescued by somebody. Somebody's going to come in and they're going to make it all better for you, and that can actually happen with men or women. There can be men who think women are going to rescue them, and vice versa. It's nobody rescues you. You're on your own here. That's the thing. And in this space on your own, you have to understand the mythologies around you, and you have to develop your own mythology, or, as Dell said, someone will shove theirs right down your throat. So that's what you have to. That's why I feel like you can't really be passive about this kind of stuff. It's important. I focus on the dark feminine because that is a piece. Like I said, this book is called, this was done in the 80s, 87, and it's called The Black Goddess in the Sixth Sense. Even then, he was saying there's this dark feminine element that's coming into the culture because it's this aspect of things. It's the Sphinx kind of, confronting the Sphinx again. How are you going to take this other information that you have written off because you literally only approach life through rational means, through your eyesight, through the ramblings that go on in your head, probably only of which 10% are actually beneficial to anything most of the time. And also in what's going on unconsciously in the background that you're just accepting. And we have the additional problem that we live in a time frame where you've got, where we have so much information. I mean, I went to school in the 70s and the 80s, I graduated in 1990. So for me, I grew up in a world where there was no internet. I didn't deal with internet till grad school, okay? And maybe, did I deal with it towards the end? Yeah, I guess 89, 90, yeah, okay. So I guess we sort of had rudimentary internet then, but it wasn't things that people used for research at that time. Probably by the time I started my MLS degree, that's when we were starting to talk about when Google became a thing and rank retrieval became a thing, and when that became something that came into the way of thinking. But Google back then was all probably legit websites. Now it's just a mess of everything. And so it's not the same. So there is so much information out there now. I mean, you just pick up your phone or you pick up whatever. It's just coming at you all the time. And so some of the reactions I think people, especially when we're talking millennials, when we're talking Gen Z, and it doesn't just have to be them, it can be people from my generation and older as well. There's definitely this kind of reaction of like this to all this information. You want to, leave me alone. So you want to just find the little spaces that you're comfortable in, because with all this stuff coming at you all the time, it's too much to process. Our minds are not designed to process this. So we've really got to get back to the idea of, learning to get away from all of that intellectual stuff or all of that stuff that's kind of, that we're being bombarded with, all these images and these stories, and get back into that kind of quiet space where you can hear what your own instinct is actually telling you. What is your own inner voice actually telling you? I mean, some people believe in guides and stuff. Okay, fine. What are your inner guides telling you? Who's telling you? Where is this information coming from? And this is only something that comes when we don't immediately say, right, I need to act, I need to jump in and take control of this thing. It only happens when we say, no, I have to step back, I have to not just think about this, I have to feel it out. And feel your emotions are included in that, and just your internal voice, because that will teach you more about what's going on than what that's going to teach you more about what's happening a lot of the times than the ramblings of your mind, which does not have all the information. There's a part of you that's connected in that kind of goes, Jung would talk about the collective unconscious as being outside of time. So there's something that kind of naturally gravitates you to the directions you need to go. And there may be certain symbols, stories, narratives, figures, deities for some people, demonic figures for some people, that are going to either inspire you or make you feel that that's the path. But it has to be your path. It can't be, I'm talking about the dark feminine, but I'm not going to tell you what your path is. I'm not going to tell you everybody's path is to worship Kali or whatever, because it's not. Everybody has to make their own path. And, some people like traditional religion. Okay. I don't, but the idea that we have to get away, first of all, that's the idea of that there's one reality and one truth. And that isn't true. That's not the world that we live in. Even if we want to believe that there may be some unity to our reality, it's not going to be something that you can simplify down to one thing. So I think if there's a core message here about this, you want to recognize that this is the mythology that's ruling our culture, or that these different streams of mythologies are the ones that drive a lot of the narrative, a lot of the decision, a lot of what media says. And you need to say, okay, I know that's what's going on. And like any myth, there may be aspects of it that are true and aspects that are false. And if people are living in myths that are patently false, or almost pathological in the way that they are, or where they are so close to the archetype rather than simply relating to it, then that's not a direction you want to go on a social level. People can do whatever they want on an individual level, but you got to be careful where you're going on a social level. Okay, so yeah, so you want to be able to figure out where you're going your way on your own. But you need to, and you need to look at some of the information, but you don't necessarily have to take in everything that's being thrown at you, and the first thing that's being thrown at you isn't necessarily the right thing. Anyway, I'm kind of don't want to. I've reached an hour, so I think that's probably enough. But I actually want to just mention that I'm revamping my school, Scholars of the Borderland. The way that it's put together, I put a lot of it together in this house, and if you can see from watching my videos, right now I've got the sun on me, but the lighting is not great in this house. So when I'm trying to record things, if I don't have the best camera, I mean, my iPhone has one kind of a camera, but I feel like some of the quality of them needs to be redone. But these are all topics that I'm going to be taking up more aggressively in the school, and I may try to put the school on another platform where it may have may get a broader audience, or more people can find it, maybe at prices that are a little bit more affordable for them. Because I think part of the problem too is that because if I'm offering like a 15-week course, it's not cheap, so it might be better to kind of do things in pieces in other places, and because I'd rather reach people than just try to make a lot of money off of one thing. So, because I just feel like this is really important. Because again, I'm not telling you what to think, but I want to tell you that you need to figure out what your mythology is. You need to figure out what your encounter is. Because everybody psychologically lives in this world is going to encounter this material in some way, and the way that you're responding and reacting to the material. And there's a lot more than I can say about that in a live stream. But you need to figure out what it is for you, because otherwise, as my professor said, somebody else will shove it down your throat. So, anyway, thank you guys so much for watching. I see some comments, and I see my friend JR93016. Thank you very much for your kind words there, and thank you to everybody else who has joined. And I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your week. I will probably be doing some live streams also over on Transition Life Coaching, my other channel, which are more specific to my coaching practice, so that may or may not interest you. But I'll be doing some things over there this week as well. And like I said, the new Catherine of Siena podcast that I did this week is out today. And I'm always interested in people's thoughts and comments. And if you want to join my Patreon, it's patreon.com/Chthonia. I do have a lot more, more discussion there, and there's more materials and extra talks and things, and Patreon-only live streams there as well. So, So thank you so much for joining me today. Have a great rest of your day. See you certainly next week.